Street Fighter is one of the most iconic and legendary games in the fighting game genre, debuting all the way back in 1987 with the very first Street Fighter game, as designed by Takashi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto. The first game centered around Ryu, a martial artist taking part in a world-spanning tournament. And while the first game was... pretty rough, it was still a huge innovator, being the first game of its kind to allow the player to use specific controller inputs to perform special moves. But it was 1991's Street Fighter II that really brought the series, and fighting games on the whole, into the spotlight, being the foundation for many conventions of the fighting game genre that we all just kind of take for granted today. And given that I'd recently gotten into playing Street Fighter V, not to mention that we're mere days away from the highly anticipated Street Fighter VI, I thought it'd be pretty cool to bring this legendary game franchise into the What If series. That's right, World Warriors, we're taking 5 characters from the Street Fighter series and giving them teams of 4 Pokemon apiece. So grab your fistful of quarters and try to get those 7 golden letters, as I tell you what I think it'd be like if Street Fighter characters were Pokemon trainers. And just in case you've never played Street Fighter before and you're the kind of person who cares about fighting game lore, big time heckin' spoilers ahead! I think it's only fair to start things off with one of the most iconic fighting game characters, and probably one of the most recognizable video game characters overall, Chun-Li. Voiced by Jenny Kwan as of Street Fighter VI, Chun-Li debuted all the way back in Street Fighter II, and is considered the primary female protagonist of the Street Fighter series and the tritagonist of the series overall, most recognizable for her ox horns hairstyle, her instantly recognizable blue chi pao, or her incredibly muscular thighs that could absolutely crush a human skull. Resourceful, brave, and highly disciplined, Chun-Li is an Interpol officer who has a strong sense of justice and always does her best to protect the innocent, especially from the likes of the crime syndicate known as Shadaloo, ran by series antagonist M. Bison, the man responsible for killing Chun-Li's father. Caring and kind, but also determined and resilient, Chun-Li is not to be taken lightly, and she's one character whose deadly kicks you do not want to be on the other end of, especially if you don't know how to parry. Now, given that kicks are such a central part of Chun-Li's fighting style, it feels only fair to give her a few Pokemon known for their kicks. First up, Hitmonlee, a Pokemon synonymous with kick-based attacks, not to mention one based on legendary martial artist Bruce Lee, whose movies were actually part of what inspired Chun-Li to take up martial arts in the first place. Next up, another member of the Hitmon trio, that being Hitmontop, another kick-centric fighting type, and one who's known to spin on top of its head and attack with a spinning kick utilizing its 3 legs, a perfect Pokemon for Chun-Li as a reference to her iconic spinning bird kick, in which Chun-Li performs multiple upside-down rotating kicks to an opponent. After that, let's go with Galarian Zapdos. I think it's only fair to give such a legendary fighting game character a legendary Pokemon, and also its Pokédex entries state that one kick could pulverize a dump truck, not to mention the rubbing of its feathers sounds like the crackling of lightning, which could be a great reference to Chun-Li's other most noteworthy special attack, the Lightning Kick, where she releases a devastating flurry of kicks upon her unfortunate foe. And lastly, and this one might seem kinda weird, but stick with me here for a second, Clefable. I kinda figured that Clefable's mostly female gender ratio could be a decent reference to Chun-Li's status as one of the first big female video game protags in an era where women in games were largely relegated to background roles or being damsels in distress. Now, I know Clefable looks just a bit out of place with these other Pokemon on Chun-Li's team, but trust me, this pick will make a little bit more sense later. But for now, let's revisit the very first game in the franchise and talk about the other playable character from Street Fighter 1, the bold and brash Ken Masters. Voiced in Street Fighter 6 by David Matranga, Ken was actually the other playable character in the first game of the series. You know, if you had someone else to play with you, making him the quintessential player 2 of fighting games. the Luigi to Ryu's Mario, if you will, or the Virgil to his Dante, and the two of them actually share the distinction of being the only two Street Fighter characters that are playable in every installment of the franchise. Ken and Ryu have basically always been rivals, even down to having the exact same moveset in the first game. However, as the Street Fighter series went on, Ken went on a slightly different path than Ryu, both in terms of lore and fighting style. While Ryu chose to go to Thailand to face the so-called Emperor of Muay Thai, Sagat, Ken traveled to the United States, winning a massive martial arts tournament there, and meeting his girlfriend Eliza, with whom he'd eventually start a family. Friendly and cool, but with a tendency to be arrogant and brash, Ken tends to be a bit more aggressive, stylish, and unorthodox in his fighting style, compared to Ryu's more focused and cool-headed approach. But whether he's fighting to surpass Ryu, or fighting for his family, he'll never back down from a challenge, and will do whatever it takes to make sure you always remember the greatness of Ken Masters. Let's start Ken's team with a throw, mainly an aesthetic pick due to it being a fighting type Pokemon that wears a judo outfit and has red skin, perfect for Ken's most iconic look, being a red gi. Next up, we'll give Ken a Scrafty, a Pokemon with an outlaw aesthetic that's actually pretty fitting for Ken, given how he dyed his hair blonde and became something of a delinquent in junior high school, largely acting out due to his parents' constant fighting. Not to mention that Scrafty being half dark could reference the fact that, while Ken does have a pure heart and believes in honor, just like Ryu, he does tend to be more aggressive and egotistical than his counterpart. Also, Scrafty's Pokedex entry from S.H.I.E.L.D. states that, while it's aggressive, it does take good care of those closest to it, much like how Ken, despite his martial arts pursuits, cares greatly for his family. Something certain other characters might tend to poke fun at him for. After that, let's go with Infernape, a fire and fighting type who uses fire to enhance its martial arts techniques, a great callback for one of Ken's most powerful attacks. A variation of the iconic Shoryuken attack, known as the Shoryu Reppa, in which Ken hits multiple consecutive Shoryukens that set the opponent on fire. Not gonna lie, pretty fucking metal. And lastly, Gimmighoul, a Pokemon that's obsessed with gold coins, pretty fitting at this point for Ken, who, as of the first issue of the Street Fighter VI tie-in comic, Days of the Eclipse, was apparently investing in various financial side projects, including, but not limited to, cryptocurrency. That's right, people. As of Street Fighter VI, Ken Masters is a crypto bro. Well, good. Now I have another reason to not like him. You know, aside from the fact that Ken players keep steamrolling me in ranked. Okay, I think I've waited long enough to gush over my favorite Street Fighter character, so now we are absolutely taking the time to talk about my Street Fighter main, Juri Han. Voiced in all of her English appearances by Jessica Strauss since her debut in Super Street Fighter 4, Juri is a brutal practitioner of Taekwondo, living for the thrill of inflicting pain on others. She was something of a Taekwondo prodigy in her teenage years, and her father was a lawyer, prosecuting the many crimes of M. Bison Shadowloo organization, something that obviously made the Han family a target. Before too long, Bison had Juri's parents killed, an incident that also damaged Juri's left eye. Sometime later, Juri had that eye replaced by the organization known as SIN, gaining the power of a device known as the Feng Shui engine, which uses artificial ki to greatly enhance Juri's already exceptional physical capabilities, taking her strength, speed, and reaction times to dangerous levels, far beyond those of the average fighter. And she vowed to use this newfound power to get vengeance on M. Bison and Shadowloo at large, and would bring them all down if it was the last thing she ever did. Or, you know, she would, if not for the fact that M. Bison was ultimately defeated by Ryu at the end of Street Fighter V. Heading into Street Fighter VI, Juri no longer has the burning hatred of M. Bison to motivate her. Forced to live her life in a gloomy haze, always seeking out the next thrill, just out of reach of a revenge she can never obtain. Thus, she basically spends all her time now enjoying spicy food, riding motorcycles, and being a bisexual icon. Oh, you mean you didn't know that? Yeah, turns out Juri's original likes and dislikes thing back in Super Street Fighter 4 was meant to be spicy food, spiders, and large breasts, before someone at Capcom came down with a case of being a fucking coward and changed it to just spicy food and spiders. But she does still have a really flirty attitude towards a lot of other fighters, regardless of gender, even accusing Chun-Li of having a schoolgirl crush. Juri Han is absolutely bisexual, and no, I will not let this go, Capcom! Anyway, speaking of not letting things go, the perfect start to Juri's Pokemon team has got to be his Hisuian Zoroark, a Pokemon driven by intense malice, a spot-on representation of the grudge that Juri has against M. Bison for causing the death of her parents. Next up is more of an aesthetic pick than anything else, Ariados, a spider Pokemon that fits pretty well given Juri's thematic association with spiders, and also the fact that the black straps attached to her top very obviously forms a spider pattern. After that, let's go with Sneasler, partly another aesthetic pick based on its color scheme, partly because its high base speed and attack make it perfect for a rushdown character like Juri, and partly because its Pokédex entry states that it prefers solitude, much like how Juri definitely prefers to do things her own way, to the point where rules is listed as one of her Street Fighter 6 dislikes. And lastly, Gengar, another purple Pokemon to match up with Juri's usual pink and purple color palette, whose Pokédex entries from red and blue state that it enjoys seeing the fright on humans' faces when it mimics their shadows under a full moon, which could be a great reference for Juri's somewhat sadistic tendency to enjoy mocking her opponents and picking them apart. Also, Gengar is there to complete her connection to Chun-Li's Clefable, since Gengar is often considered to be Clefable's shadow, and Juri herself could very easily be read as the Dark Chun-Li, with both of them using largely kick-based offense, and both having had their families destroyed by M. Bison, and swearing to take him down. See, I told you that Clefable pick would make sense later. And now, making his way to the ring, accompanied by Rainbow Mika, from the motherland of Russia, standing at 7 feet tall, weighing 399 pounds, the Red Cyclone, Zangief!
Now let's get to it!
Voiced by Peter Beckman ever since Street Fighter 4, Zangief is a massive, hulking professional wrestler and a proud representative of Russia, even being seen as a national hero. Making his debut in Street Fighter 2, Zangief is another one of those instantly recognizable video game characters, and is considered to be the first fighting game character whose style was primarily based on grappling, wanting to be up close and personal to his opponents to get them in a devastating suplex, or even his iconic spinning pile driver. Makes sense then that his likes and dislikes things have basically always noted his hatred for projectiles. Zangief is a strong, fierce combatant, having honed his skills by wrestling bears in the frozen tundra of Siberia, although training in such a cold environment seemed to do pretty little to stifle his hot temper. But despite his often short fuse, Zangief is a pretty good-natured and kind-hearted person, once entering a tournament just because he thought it would impress a bunch of school children, and he always wants everyone around him to become stronger and build more muscle. Whether that's actually a good idea for everyone he suggests that to is another question. But anyway, let's start Zangief's team with a Machamp, a Pokemon based on pro wrestlers, championship title included, whose Alpha Sapphire Pokédex entry states that, if it grabs its foe, the battle is all but over. Pretty spot on for a dangerous grappler like Zangief. Next up, we'll go with Ursaluna, whose base 130 HP and 140 attack, but fairly low speed, are great references to the fact that, while Zangief is very strong and quite bulky, he's not exactly the most mobile character in the series. Also, Ursaluna would be a great callback to the fact that Zangief honed his skills by wrestling bears. Like a lot of bears. Speaking of Zangief's training methods, I'll give him a Crabominable next, whose hidden ability, Anger Point, could reference Zangief's short temper, and the fact that it could be found in Glacedo Mountain in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet could reference the fact that Zangief does much of his training in the freezing cold of Siberia. And going back to Zangief's wrestling prowess for the last slot, let's round out his team with Incineroar, another wrestler Pokemon whose signature move, Darkest Lariat, is a perfect reference to Zangief's Cyclone Lariat, which earned him the nickname of the Red Cyclone. Plus, Incineroar is classified as the Heal Pokemon, and Zangief does have a heelish alter ego called the Geef, which is basically just Zangief in a mask. Quick question for those who are more clued in the Street Fighter lore here though, is it like known within kayfabe that the Geef is just Zangief in a mask, or like are we meant to believe that it's a completely different person? Because if it's the latter Zangief, I'm sorry, but you're not fooling anybody. I mean, you think we couldn't tell that's you with that chest hair? Because I kinda doubt it. And last, but certainly not least, the martial arts loving, spider hating protagonist of the whole Street Fighter franchise, and one of the most iconic fighting game characters in history, the man known simply as Ryu. Voiced by Kyle Hebert ever since Street Fighter 4, Ryu is the main character of the Street Fighter series and one of the only 2 characters playable in every single iteration. As such, Ryu has become something of a household name among video game characters, so recognizable that dozens of other media franchises have paid homage to, or even parodied him, to the point where I'm pretty sure that people who have never even touched a fighting game at least have some idea of who Ryu is. Not that Ryu himself would ever indulge in that kind of notoriety, mind you. Quiet, humble, and sometimes self-deprecating, Ryu's life is wholly dedicated to his training, believing that he can always become stronger and make himself better as a person through martial arts. To that end, unlike his contemporary Ken Masters, he's mostly stayed away from modern culture, choosing instead to focus on his training, and gaining something of a wandering warrior reputation because of that. However, he's had more than his fair share of run-ins with the likes of the evil and Bison, as well as his Shadowloo underlings, more than willing to step up to bring the mad dictator down if called upon to do so, and he'll gladly trade blows with anyone who seeks to harm the innocent, truly embodying his nickname of the World Warrior. Let's start Ryu's team with something of an aesthetic pick. Hitmonchan, whose red boxing gloves are a pretty good fit for Ryu's own signature red gloves. Plus, Hitmonchan's Pokédex entries in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald all detail its indomitable spirit, noting that it'll never give up in the face of adversity, perfect for Ryu's unbending determination to better himself, and even those around him, through martial arts. Speaking of which, let's also give Ryu a sock, a Pokemon whose Pokédex entry states that it secludes itself in the mountains to train tirelessly, perfect for a character who often trains in isolation to find true strength. Also, Sokka is there to complete the dynamic with Ken's throw, considering that the two could be read as being rivals, much like Ryu and Ken themselves, not to mention that both of these Pokemon have a base stat total of 465. After that, we're gonna go with an Urshifu, specifically the single strike form, as its signature move, Wicked Blow, could be a good reference to Ryu's focus attack, which itself is a devastating single strike. Also, Urshifu being half dark is perfect for someone who spends a good chunk of his story arc dealing with an inner darkness, something known as the Satsui no Hado, which, by the way, translates to wave motion of murderous intent. God, that's just so fucking metal! A dark force that seeks to twist Ryu's desire for strength and martial arts mastery into a bloodthirsty desire to kill, to the point where said force even managed to manifest itself into a physical form temporarily. And last but certainly not least, there's no way I can make a Pokemon team for Ryu without giving him a Lucario, the Pokemon most heavily associated with the attack known as Aura Sphere, a blazing blue ball of energy shot from the palms of the opponent, which is basically just the Hadoken attack that's most heavily associated with Ryu. In fact, Ryu and Lucario go so well together that, in the 2D fighting fan game Pokemon Type Wild, a game that longtime Super Nerd Daniel viewers might remember me playing on this very channel some years back, Lucario functioned largely the same as Ryu, and yes, he has the Aura Sphere, and yes, it's basically the Hadoken. Now, I'm not saying that you should go out of your way to find this game that uses Pokemon's copyrighted characters in a totally unofficial and probably not legal way, but what I am saying is that Pokemon themselves have already stopped featuring their actual fighting game, Pokken Tournament DX, in any official capacity, so hey, I mean, I won't snitch if you won't. But now I want to hear from you. What Pokemon do you think these Street Fighter characters would have on their teams? And are there any other Street Fighter characters you'd want me to include in a future video in this series? Let me know in the comments below. Give this video a like if you liked it, subscribe for more videos like this in the future, share it on your favorite social medias, and ring the bell so you'll always be notified when I upload. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video, friendos.